Okay, hello everyone. I think we can kick off. I can see people still coming into the room. My name's Charles Grant. I'm from the Centre for European Reform. I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar on looking at the results of the French elections and what they mean for Europe. This is an on-the-record session. We're going to put the recording on our website on YouTube, and we'll try and make a podcast out of it too. So thanks very much to our three panelists for showing up today. Francois Aisbourg sadly had to drop out for personal reasons at the last minute, but thanks very much to Ben Haddad from the Atlantic Council for joining us at very short notice. The running order is going to be firstly Christine Ockrent, who, as I'm sure everybody knows, is a very eminent French journalist and broadcaster, made lots of TV programs on French radio and television about Europe. And she's going to talk a bit about the domestic situation in France, French politics, and what the changes there may mean for Europe. So I'm going to turn to Pascal Lamy, former head of the World Trade Organization, former European Commissioner and Chief of Staff to Jacques Delors, who will talk a bit about the economic side of the French election results and what that means for Europe. And then I turn finally to Ben Haddad from the Atlantic Council in Washington, who's going to talk about some of the security implications of the French election results. So thanks to everybody for joining us today. I like our introducers to speak for just 5 or 7 minutes maximum, so we have plenty of time for discussion. We've got a fantastic group of people in the audience today, some of whom have very, very great points to make, I'm sure. So that's enough from me. I turn now to Christine. How does it look to you, Christine?
Well, hello, Charles. Hello, everybody. Emmanuel Macron won indeed a remarkable victory last Sunday, although the usual stringent music coming from most French commentators did claim quite wrongly that he was badly elected. He was well elected. I won't bore you with figures, but he did get 58.5 on a turnout, on a 72% turnout. I think it's interesting to compare that to Boris Johnson's performance at the last general elections in the UK. He got 51.3% for a 71% turnout. So that, I think, gives, of course, the voting system is different, but I think it gives you a point of comparison. Now, for all that matters, let us keep in mind the figures of the first round of our presidential election, because it showed that France has really crystallized into 3 blocks. The central bloc, Macrons, being the highest, but with 2 very strong extreme left and extreme right. Now we have legislative elections coming out in 7 weeks. Those elections, usually, as they follow the presidential one, have been met by Chirac a few years back to actually help the newly elected president to have a comfortable majority as a sort of launching pad. Now, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is the sort of far left firebrand, very talented, but really willing to say anything that would satisfy his personal vanity, I would say, even if I'm on the record. Mélenchon immediately spoke on TV the very night of Macron's election, saying, "Now the people of France, you have to elect me prime minister." Of course, it doesn't make any sense in terms of our institutions, but it was a very smart political move. Now, the problem is that Mélenchon, for the time being, has 17 MPs in the National Assembly. To reach the majority, he would need to get some 289 MPs elected. The same would apply to Marine Le Pen, who also claimed that she had won, although she had lost, but she did gain many more votes than last time. Now, Le Pen, for the time being, has exactly, let me check, 7 MPs. What happens in mid-June. All those people who voted for Le Pen and for Mélenchon will, of course, be intensely frustrated, even though these two political parties may well get more seats. They are poorly rooted in the country. They don't have that many people, especially the far right, able to run. And so there will be huge disappointment, probably, from those voters who actually claim their preference to them on the 10th of April on the first round. Now, those elections are the only chance for two really dying political parties, those two parties which actually ran the country for so many years. The Socialist Party, almost dead. François Hollande today said that making an alliance with Mélenchon actually meant the death of the Socialist Party. The Socialist Party in the current National Assembly has quite a few seats, not sure that he can maintain them. And the Conservatives, who, as you may remember, got less than 5% of the votes on the first round, they do have a rather sizable group of MPs who will, of course, fight for survival. Some of them trying to find an alliance with the Macron people and others with the Le Pen people. So it will be an infighting of within that same political crowd who is actually rather disliked, if not despised, by those voters who have chosen to vote for the extreme. So that means that there will be a lot of political discontent and social discontent when it comes to the aftermath of those parliamentary elections. Mélenchon's supporters already saying, oh, we will just take to the streets. Now, what does it mean for Europe? Very briefly, it will mean, first of all, that Emmanuel Macron will have to devote a lot of time, more time than he would probably wish, for social but also environmental issues. He promised to do so in his victory speech, which was quite sober. His job will be very difficult indeed. But as we all know, Europe is so much in his DNA that he will certainly want to pursue some of his major European ambitions. And of course, the pressure of the war in Ukraine does work, it seems to me, as a kind of accelerator for all EU countries, except maybe Mr. Orban, for all EU countries to consider some of Macron's ambitions, including, but then I guess Ben Haddad will talk about that, the so-called strategic autonomy. But then again, social, economic, domestic issues will prevail.
Thank you very much, Christine. I turn now to Pascal Lamy, who I'm sure will perhaps touch briefly upon some of the economic implications of the election. Will the EU pursue French policies on changing the fiscal rules, on developing a second recovery and resilience facility, for example? But over to you, Pascal. How does it look to you?
Thanks, Charles. Let me first say I agree very much with a lot of what Christine has said on the domestic side. Macron won a clear victory with unclear consequences. And this is one of the problems of the years to come. And those of us who are, let's say, on the center-left side, now fear a sort of Obama syndrome. One mandate, two mandates with, let's say, reasonable politics whether you like them or not, and then boom, Trump. So this is something which one needs to have in mind when you look at the big scene of French politics. And my third addition to what Christine said would be for those of you who are old enough to remember the Maastricht referendum 30 years ago in 1992, which was very closely won by the pro referendum, the one that wanted to ratify this treaty. If you compare the map of the Maastricht Treaty 1992 and the map of the second round of the presidential elections, they are incredibly similar. If you look at geography, if you look at level of revenue, if you look at level of education, if you look at distance from where you live to center towns, and that says something of the real divisions that the French political system, like many others in Europe, has not properly factored in. Now, to answer more precisely your question, Charles, on the economic policy side, no surprise. Macron will run a Macronian strange mix like the one he's been running in his first 5 years, although with specific circumstances with the COVID crisis. He will run a very specific sort of breed of supply side measures, reforms that increase the competitiveness of the French economy, that reform the labor market, that reform the pension systems on the one side, and on the other side, a rather Keynesian fiscal stance, which is, again, a very specific breed of his own, which is not common, but which he believes is the right thing to do. Alongside the slogan of his first electoral campaign, you need to open, to free, to liberate on the one side, and you need to protect the weaker part of the population on the other side. And this is where I depart from most commentators who believe that Macron is a centrist. No, Macron is not a centrist. Macron is right-wing in economics and left-wing in part of the social issues. And this is not, in my view, the definition of a centrist. As far as his second mandate, he will insist on an area which he had not insisted a lot during his first mandate, which is the ecological transition, which probably will be a backbone of his economic, social, and environmental policy, a sort of a French version of what the EU adopted as the Green Deal after the elections of 2019. So brace for a higher attention to the rhythm and the conditions of the energy transition, on which he has already taken a clear stance during the campaign, for instance, in seriously increasing the availability of nuclear energy, which is something that has divided France, although much less than in other European countries. And as far as the European level, and that's my final point, expect a Macron who will keep putting in practice his European theory, which he deployed in this famous Sorbonne speech at the beginning of his first mandate. And this is an area where Macron has a vision, whereas on other things, He's been characterized by a lot of tactical maneuvering. Europe is an area where he has a vision. He wants a more integrated Europe. He wants a more sovereign Europe. He wants a Europe that builds a defense pillar within NATO, and he wants a Europe that doesn't enlarge that much. So the vision is clear. Whether he will be able to keep moving this as he did it reasonably successfully during his first mandate is unclear, although he's now clearly the strong man around the European Council table. In terms of leadership, he is the European leader that has the larger clout around the European table. The German Chancellor is a freshman, and his coalition, traffic light coalition, is not working that well for the moment. And others, of course, are usually less influential countries, where there will be problems, as I mentioned, and I will finish by that, is probably on the rhythm and the possibilities of further enlargements, which the French are not in favor of. And this Ukraine situation for the moment is so emotional that it's not the real terms of the debate. And of course, this issue of how do you build a European pillar within NATO is fraughted with difficulties which are very serious. But I think he will still be looking to push this forward. Over to you, Charles.
Thank you very much, Pascal, for covering a lot of ground very quickly. I turn now finally to Ben Haddad. Ben, really, Pascal set you up because he's talked a little bit already about the strategic autonomy agenda, which is a phrase that goes down badly in parts of Central and Eastern Europe. But many people would argue that post the Ukraine war, the case for strategic autonomy has, not just in the area of defense, but in other areas too, like energy and technology has become stronger than ever. Do you think Macron will push ahead with his strategic autonomy agenda? Will the Americans accept it, and will the Central Europeans accept it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think first, I completely agree with how Pascal closed, that he is now the most senior European leader at the EU Council table. Of course, you have a double event, which is the war in Ukraine, that has put back security issues at the core of the agenda on the European Union, and the German transition with a less experienced, less central leader, Olaf Scholz, taking over in Germany, and Macron now being sort of the senior partner, I think, in this relationship. First, I think, look, there's a few issues. I think that it's clear that we're debating whether Macron will take more of a social and environmental turn domestically, and I agree with him being more free market liberal on economically, and more to the maybe center left, to social on social and cultural issues. One thing that has been really at the core of his political identity ever since he created his political platform En Marche in 2016 has been Europe, clearly, and has been the defense of a robust Europe that could give itself the instruments, the tools to be able to assert its power on the world stage between the United States and China, depend less on the United States from a military standpoint, and give itself the ability to defend its trade interests, its security interests, have its own identity on technological issues. It wasn't really noticed because of Ukraine, but just in the last few weeks, during the French presidency of the European Union, the Digital Service Act and the Digital Markets Act, which were both big priorities when it comes to digital regulation and sovereignty, were concluded at a European level. Which is an interesting conversation to have as Elon Musk takes over Twitter. And you have all of this program, all of this vision that was laid out in his Sorbonne speech in 2017 on European sovereignty. By the way, I think European sovereignty is probably a better term to really encompass what Macron wants to do at the European level than just strategic autonomy. And I agree with you that strategic autonomy has been often poorly translated or misunderstood, misexplained as well by the French to some of our partners, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. But so I should re-explain maybe that it has never meant an independent Europe from the United States. And I think it's very clear from France's participation to NATO reassurance in Central and Eastern Europe, the stepping up of presence in countries like Romania or Estonia in recent weeks, that this is mostly about giving Europeans the ability to defend their security alone if needed, especially in a context where the United States is pivoting to Asia, which is, I think, something structural that the war in Ukraine will not change, and especially is signaling clearly its intention not to intervene on the behalf of Europeans in areas like North Africa, the Middle East, the Mediterranean, like we had, or the Western Balkans for that matter, like we have seen in the 90s and the 2000s. So I think Macron and a lot others in Europe draw the conclusions that it's both in the interest of the Europeans, but of course of the United States as well. It's an asset for the United States to see Europeans stepping up, taking on more responsibility. And the trend that we've seen in the last few weeks with several European countries, first and foremost Germany, but not limited to Germany, announcing an increase in defense spending and rearming, is of course here an interesting example that's both in the interest of the US, but and it's been, as you know, a tension in the transatlantic relationship in the last few years with Trump, of course, but even before that, but also in the interest of the vision of European sovereignty that Macron has been trying to lay out. You mentioned it, it's not limited to military issues. Energy security is really core to the conversation right now. And here again, I think you have an area where France can play an interesting role as with nuclear power and diversification of suppliers. It's much less dependent on Russian energy, Russian oil and gas than some of its partners like Germany. So France has been trying to cautiously push some of its partners towards more stringent sanctions on Russian energy, especially making the case for an embargo on Russian oil. But as you said, I mean, there's the war in Ukraine has also brought back the United States to the continent, has brought back the security of our Central and Eastern European partners to the fore. And I think one of the big challenges in the second term, I think the intellectual vision for European sovereignty has been laid out in the last 5 years. You've also had major successes, such as the creation of common debt with the European Recovery Package, which I think creates an interesting precedent for further resilience plans at the European level. If tomorrow, for example, we need to build up solidarity measures to cover the cost of sanctions on gas, and if they were to come more quickly than we expect, we've seen Russia cut gas to Bulgaria and Poland this week. If it were to, I'm skeptical that it will, but if Russia were to cut gas to other European countries, it would probably have to use the precedent of the next generation EU recovery package to build up resilience and solidarity at the European level. But you will have challenges, I think, in laying out and implementing the sovereignty agenda in the second term. And here we'll have to learn some of the lessons of the first one. I think in the first couple of years of his term, Macron put a very strong emphasis on the bilateral relationship with Germany, and especially the personal relationship with Chancellor Merkel, sometimes at the expense of building different kinds of ad hoc coalitions or relationships with other smaller countries. I think we've also paid for 30 years of misunderstandings with Central and Eastern European countries, where we'll have to really reinvest heavily in the next few years. We'll have to rebuild the relationship with the United Kingdom. I think the war in Ukraine has also shown that the UK is back to taking, I think, a forceful role in European security, and that's something that can also be an asset for France. I mean, there's no European defense without a strong UK anchored to the continent, and a lot of us were very disappointed after Brexit that we can find an arrangement on a security and defense relationship with the United Kingdom. So let's hope also that that's something that can be rebuilt. And to the last point on the US, I do think clearly that it's in the interest of the United States to see a robust European Union on the world stage. The devil is in the detail. How can we build a European defense industrial base that is autonomous and doesn't compete with American interest? And that's something that we'll have to work on in the next few years. But the small momentum we've seen post-AUKUS with the Rome declaration in the United States coming out clearly saying that EU defense was complementary with NATO is something that we can build upon in the next few years.
Thank you very much, Ben. We're going to move in a moment to comments and questions. Can I just say to people, the easiest thing for me is if you put your hand up, and if you go to the list of participants, put up your hand, then I can see you want to ask a question. But if you can also try the chat function as well. I'll hopefully see your comments in the chat function. While you're thinking your questions, let me just kick off with one of my own. A couple of days ago, I published a short CR paper on what Macron's victory meant for Europe. And I thought, obviously, he's very influential, as all our panelists have said. He's the supreme, preeminent European leader at the moment. But there will be resistance to some of his ideas. Ben has already mentioned that not all the Central Europeans agree with all the French ideas on the future of the EU. And certainly, in my view, there's been sometimes a blind spot in Paris in failing to take sufficient account of what the preferences of Central Europeans are. Not everybody in Paris has woken up to the fact that the EU enlarged in 2004. In particular, when it comes to issues, well, the rule of law issue obviously is not the whole of Central Europe, it's mainly Poland and Hungary. That's still a very difficult issue, which has the potential to create lots of ructions and lots of sorrow in the EU, and possibly Hungary vetoing some decisions that require unanimity if the EU gets too tough with it. There's the migration issue. Obviously, the Central Europeans have a different view of migration. There's defence, as Ben mentioned, where at least there's some suspicion of French thinking on strategic autonomy in central parts of Central Europe. And there's even the British dimension, where it's quite clearly, because of the events in Ukraine, some Baltic and Central European countries and even some Nordics would be reluctant to throw the rule book at the British if the British renege on the Northern Ireland Protocol, which they may do very soon. So my first question to the panelists is, are you worried that Macron's vision and all his ideas for the future of Europe may stumble to some degree through failure to take on board the views of Central Europeans? Or is there a way around that? Can he learn from, as Ben said, the mistakes of his first term in office and find ways of charming the Central Europeans to follow some of his wishes? Don't know if any of our three panelists would like to pick up that question. Okay, Ben?
Sure. First, a couple quick points on this. I mean, it's important to remember that there are 27 members of the European Union, and not only Central Europeans. And when often we think of Central Europeans, we tend to think of Poland, Hungary. I think you've seen really strong relationships being deepened between France and countries like Estonia, where France has rotating troops, Romania just in the last few months. I think Slovakia and the Czech Republic, which have elected pro-European governments, Slovenia just recently, can be also really interesting partners. With Poland and Hungary, it's trickier. The rule of law issue has also sort of thrown a wrench in the relationships there. And once again, I mean, the point you made about enlargement is a very good one, where there's still a suspicion, I think, over the French nostalgia for the Carolingian 1960s Europe that clearly will have to be addressed and overcome. But it's important to remember also that some less vocal members of the EU, from Spain to Italy to Belgium and others, probably feel closer to the French, or Greece in the Mediterranean, and feel closer to the French vision to a certain extent than is often assumed.
Thank you. Would Pascal or Christine like to comment?
Well, yeah, go ahead, Christine.
Pardon, Pascal. No, just a quick comment, because it really struck me that I think it's about the first time that the French presidential election has caught up so much interest and indeed anguish throughout the continent and even across the Channel. It is the first time that, Scholz, Costa, the Portuguese, and Sanchez, the Spaniard, actually published an open letter, 3 social democrats, to see how important this election is. As if, and Charles, it's one of the points you made in an earlier paper, it's as if there is indeed a sort of common space for European public opinion to shape up. And that is beyond bilateral issues, particularly between Macron and the Polish regime. It is something which, with all the emotional wave due to Ukraine, is sort of crystallizing, I think, throughout the continent, at least. And another point I'd like to make is that indeed Macron has promised that, of course, he has learned from the mistakes he committed during the first mandate. And indeed, there will be, I believe, less insistency on bilateral issues and another balance within Europe, because Mario Draghi in particular, but also the Dutch, Rutte, who was not particularly a particular fan of Macron. I think there are new alliances, if you will, it will be very interesting, and of course Greece that Ben mentioned, very interesting to see how this plays out in the forthcoming ordeals that we will all have to share, starting of course with economic ones.
Pascal?
I'm less worried than you are, Charles, on this, because I believe that on the issues you mentioned, Macron is ahead of the French public opinion and of the Quai d'Orsay, which is the consensus among high-flying French diplomats. What you say is right as far as the French public opinion is concerned, or as far as the software of the French diplomacy is concerned, but Macron is on a more open mind. He has proven this in his first mandate, entertaining a lot of dialogue with Eastern and Central Europe and Baltic states, contrary to his predecessors. So on a second mandate, he probably is as ready to take risks as he was in his first mandate. And remember that the French President of the Republic remains the master of foreign policy, including European policy, and that whatever comes out of the parliamentary elections, the French president has a very strong hand in the institutional system over these issues. Over to you.
Thank you. I see a question from Peter Mandelson, who I'm going to turn to in a moment, then from Paul Scooter Christofferson. Peter Mandelson, of course, a former European Commissioner, Paul Scooter Christofferson, a very senior European official. And then I can see David Hannay, a former Perm Rep, and Vernon Bogdaner, the professor who taught David Cameron about the world. So plenty of questions coming up. If Mario Monti wanted to put his hand up, I'd love to take his question too. First, I turn to Peter Mandelson.
Thank you, Charles, very much. Could I make just two observations? The first is in response to Ben's point about the United Kingdom and European security. I think that what Ukraine has done is to shatter the British illusion that somehow with Brexit, we could move on from Europe and leave it behind. That has been shattered in my view, but the implications of it, I don't think will be realized in number 10 Downing Street with its present incumbent. I think that for a British Conservative government to realize that our security really is in Europe, that we have to play our part in building up European capability within NATO, and that this requires the building of a European pillar, which is more independent of, but not separate from the United States, is not something that's going to dawn on our present Prime Minister. I think a new Prime Minister of either party will be needed before these full consequences are thought through. My second is to say this, that inevitably, I strongly welcome and celebrate Emmanuel Macron's victory. Because I'm a centre-left politician, and he's a centrist in economics and left-wing in social policy, as Pascal has observed, but also because of his Europeanism, which I strongly support. But here's my question, and that is whether his personal success has come at the expense of France's long-term institutional political strength, and that whether the fact that he has his movement, which is a very personality-driven movement, has in effect crushed both the centre-left and centre-right parties, opening up the way to political extremism and organisation and success on the extremes of both left and right in France, is something that we should be very worried about indeed in respect of its long-term implications for French politics.
Thank you, Peter. Before I come back to our panelists, I'd like to take a couple more points, and we'll take 2 or 3 points in each round before we come back to the panelists. I turn now to Paul Scooter Christofferson, if you're there, Paul.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for this this meeting. I have a question to Pascal, because it's about trade policy. During the French presidency until now, we have seen a lot of achievements, for instance, in the digital area, but we, as far as I can see, have also had practically a complete blockage of trade policy, at least trade policy in the form of concluding new bilateral agreements, even though a number of those agreements are ready. And we have not had much success in our campaign to revitalize the WTO. Do you think, Pascal, that that could change in the last month of the French presidency?
Okay. Before we come back to, let's take one more point from the floor. We'll turn to Professor Vernon Bogdanor, then we'll have a second round of questions with Mario Monti, David Hannay and James Spencer. But now I turn to Vernon, then we'll come back to our panelists. Vernon.
It seems to me that Macron's victory raises 2 important questions for France and the European Union. Firstly, for France, the Fifth Republic institutionalizes a monarchical and Jupiterian presidency, and this has weakened both parliament and civil society, it seems to me, and it did so from the 1960s until the revolution or attempted revolution of 1968. And under Macron, there's been considerable popular alienation from the presidency. If the president doesn't have a majority, then he loses most of his powers. He has just constitutional powers, and there's a danger of deadlock. So my first question is whether the Fifth Republic is any longer fit for purpose. It was introduced at a time when people were much more deferential to strong leadership of de Gaulle than they are now. And it seems to me these problems of popular alienation are likely to continue. My second point is about Europe, that President Macron said in Britain in 2017 after Brexit that he could not guarantee that if a referendum were held in France, there wouldn't be a similar outcome. And Donald Tusk said that Brexit had lessons for the European Union. Now in France, as Pascal Lamy has said, Maastricht was passed by a very narrow majority and France rejected the European Constitution. There seems to be the enthusiasm of the political class towards further European integration seems not to be shared by the population at large. And we see all over Europe that when the European Union entrenches upon national sensibilities, in particular immigration, there is a reaction. Yet Macron is proposing further integration. What is he doing to ensure that the alienation from Europe that is there in France and a number of other European countries is remedied? Surely not by further integration, but by ensuring that Europe becomes more accountable to people in the various member states. Thank you.
Thank you, Vernon. If our panelists could respond, please, not to all of those questions, just pick up one or two to answer, otherwise we won't be able to fit in everybody else. But so let's go in inverse order. Let's go to Ben first, then Pascal, then Christine. Ben.
Sure. Well, maybe I'll take the two last questions we just heard, first on the institutions and then on the European Union and French public opinion towards that, because I tend to be less critical than you. First on the institutions, look, I mean, he was reelected with a pretty large margin and a turnout that's low by French standards, but high if you would to compare it to the United States or the United Kingdom. I do think that clearly our institutions need refreshing, not so much because of the Fifth Republic institutions, but because of the shift from the 7-year to the 5-year term, where we decided to put the parliamentary election a month after, which I think has really, I think Christine was mentioning this earlier, has really re-centralized the institutions even more around the figure of the president, who now is sort of both the president and the prime minister. Maybe introducing a dose of proportionality in the elections, maybe more decentralization, maybe having the parliamentary elections before or the same day as the presidential one would rebalance a little bit the relationship between the executive and the parliamentary branch. But, you know, without going too much into history and culture here, this is also the way, you know, de Gaulle's genius was understanding that as he drafted the institutions, he made sort of a synthesis of French history, which have institutions have always been very centralized, very monarchical. And I think there's a demand for this. François Hollande, before Emmanuel Macron, tried to build a more sort of normal, as he called it, day-to-day, closer, less monarchical presidency, and that was massively rejected by the French population. So there is this very peculiar relationship to the president, who is almost kind of a king figure. You have a monarchy, we don't, but we've introduced some elements of this within the presidency. So it's a fine, I think, balance to find. On the European dimension, every poll suggests that there's a large majority of the French population that at least does not want to leave the European Union, does not want to leave the euro. That has actually explained why Marine Le Pen did so poorly in 2017 because of her Frexit program. So de facto 2017 was a referendum on the European Union. And Macron, at the debate against Marine Le Pen, pushed her on her inability to explain how she would leave the euro, for example. This is why she tried to moderate her program, this time not officially in favor of Frexit, although if you look at the measures, it de facto led to a Frexit or a complete paralysis of the European Union. And I think Macron's approach to the EU has never been federalist. He's not a pro-EU ideologue, but precisely, I think, drawing the conclusions from the backlash that we saw with Brexit. It was the idea that the European Union should have the elements of sovereignty to defend its borders, for example, to defend its trade interests. So it's not just a vast NGO with no identity, no rootedness. It is a political organization that relies on its member states, but also has the ability to defend its identity and its interests. So I think Macron's approach here is first quite popular with the French on European issues, but also I think reflects deeply on the backlash against the EU that we have seen in the 90s and the 2000s, where it's seen as too disconnected from the concerns of everyday citizens.
Thank you, Ben. Turn on to Pascal.
Yeah, let me take the question on trade first by Paul. He's right. If you look at the agenda of the French presidency, there is not much of a pro-opening offensive trade measure on the agenda. What's on the agenda is all on the defensive side. Digital, CBAM, anti-coercion instrument, anti-subsidy instrument. And this is not just a welcome coincidence between what the French public believes about trade and the European agenda. It's a sign of times. And by the way, if you look at the Commission proposals in the area of trade, there is nothing in recent times that looks like a new multilateral or bilateral or regional trade opening agreement. So that's a sign of times. The EU has decided that with a weak WTO, the urgency was to make sure that you had a defensive arsenal that allows you to fight against either US or Chinese hyper-constraining trade measures, which is the lesson of recent times. As far as WTO is concerned, I think the EU has not changed its mind, nor has the Commission, nor have the member states, that this should be the prime institution for regulating multilateral trade. But the reality is that the EU has not been strong enough to bring back the US to the WTO table. So the WTO is not working well for a series of reasons, but the main reason is that the US have deserted the WTO for the last 5 or 6 years, and whatever window dressing they cleverly do in Washington or Geneva, they are de facto totally passive. On Peter's first question, I totally agree that if and when the Russian invasion of Ukraine stops, and that's, in my view, the only way this can end, there will need to be a new a new European architecture of security and defense. And as many continental Europeans, I do not see how the UK could not be part of that. Now, it's for the British people to decide now or later if it should happen. Let me just remind that when the Brexit happened, there was a question whether Brexit agreement should or not contain a foreign and security policy leg, and that the British answer to this question was no, because at the time, the Prime Minister, that's at least my interpretation, thought that this would risk blurring the picture of a clear leaving. Brexit has to be done. So further links of this kind are not on the cards. And finally, on the last point of Peter Mandelson, the question of whether Macron has exploded the French political system or whether Macron is the result of an explosion of the French political system is an open question. It's a chicken and egg, and I'm not sure he's not for something in what's happening, but I also know that there are many good reasons why the center left and the center right crumbled the way they crumbled, even without any sort of pressure from Macron. So it's probably a combination of both. Over to you.
Thank you. Now I got finally Christine, then we got 4 more questions to squeeze in, which I think we can do if everybody talks very quickly. Christine, over to you.
You need to unmute, Christine.
Christine, you're muted.
Okay.
That's better. We can hear you now.
Okay, sorry. Just to add on to what Pascal said about the traditional political parties, just ask yourself why the extreme right and the extreme left have done so well. That's because the French conservatives and the French socialists are more or less brain dead and have been for many years. As Pascal said, they were already moribund in 2017, which explains why Macron was able to succeed. So now, if they want to still survive, they have to get to work and have an offer to their, to the voters. Macron cannot be responsible for the whole political spectrum, but of course he's taken advantage of that. Now, the issue, of course, is to renew our institutions, which is one of the points that were made also, and that's why the promise to include some proportional voting, which after all is the system all over the continent, some proportional voting has to be implemented, but for that matter, that's the way our own parliament works. The Senate, which is dominated by conservatives, has to agree. So that's where our institutions, however presidential, become once again a little bit parliamentary.
Thank you, Christine. Vicky Price seems to have taken her hand down, which gives me only got three questions left. So I turn David Hannay, Maria Monti, and James Spencer. David, can you open up, please, David? You're on mute, David.
I keep pressing unmute.
We can hear you now.
Yep, that's good. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you to our three splendid briefers. I'd like to ask a question about the possible direction of Macron's and France's policy on future enlargement. I think it's no secret that it's been hostile up to now. The French have either been instrumental or behind the scenes very influential in preventing negotiations with Albania and North Macedonia. And now we have three new applicants, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, who pose all pretty big problems, but who can't simply be told to buzz off. So what is France's policy likely to be? It surely is not possible to believe that Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine will start negotiations, which could last for many, many years, of course, and North Macedonia and Albania and other West Balkan countries simply being left in a kind of purgatory. So what's the French policy going to be in the future?
Thank you, David. Maria Monti, former Italian Prime Minister, over to you.
I agree with the panel. Emmanuel Macron is going to be the most influential leader in the EU. What has not been said yet is that is going to be not only the most powerful political leader, but also the most intellectually powerful political leader in Europe. This is a novel situation. As far as my memory goes back, there has never been a coincidence between the politically dominating figure of the European Council and the personality who is recognized as being an intellectual leader of that group. This was not so during the Merkel years, not so during the Schröder years. There was at any rate the competition with Tony Blair at that time intellectually. And maybe one has to go back to a time when the most powerful intellectually was not really a head of government, but was the president of the Commission, Jacques Delors, largely thanks to one member of this panel. Now, this time we will have the coincidence between the most powerful politically and the most lucid intellectually, who has, by the way, had the enormous merit of being instrumental in the fact that Ursula von der Leyen is now the president of the Commission and not the other good man, Mr. Weber, not at that level. Now, given this coincidence, and there is, I think, even beyond Europe, certainly not in the US, not in Russia, maybe in China, a leader of the intellectual stature of Macron. Now, I'm asking the panel, how will this objective, wide leadership materialize in terms of the vision and the implementation of global governance, when universalism through the UN is all but dead, when effective governance through the G7 and the G20 have been in two stages paralyzed, the G7 with the first Ukrainian crisis, the G20 now with the second Ukrainian crisis. What is going to happen? Aren't we lucky to have a man with a universalistic vision of France and with his, I believe, recognized intellectual charisma? Where will he bring us?
Thank you, Macron. Thank you very much, Mario, for being so positive and optimistic. Finally, if you could keep it very brief, please, James, just a quick point from James Spencer.
Thank you very much. Mr. Macron has said that he's heard the people on the other side, he's going to listen, and that he's going to heal France. We've seen that sort of thing in the US, but it doesn't seem to have worked. Can he do it? Does he have the will to do so, or are we going to see more protests and more gilets jaunes, et cetera, et cetera?
Thank you for the brevity. Okay, with everybody's permission, we're going to go just 2 minutes over time because I want to give our panelists a chance to respond to at least one or two of the very interesting points we've heard from that last round of questions. Let's go back to our original order. So first Christine, then Pascal, then Ben. Christine, pick up a couple of those points if you'd like.
Well, I'm quite embarrassed to try and answer Mario Monti's almost philosophical approach to what a leader should be. I fully subscribe, of course, to what you've said, but what matters is, of course, political skill. And Macron, unfortunately, has not always showed such skill, probably carried away as he was by his intellect rather than his emotions or his empathy. And that's very much, of course, the objection that has been made by many of his opponents, although it's been widely exaggerated, but it's a fact. So I think in order for Macron to play out his obvious talents, even on the European scene and on the international scene, he will have to show probably more sensitivity to his various partners, starting, of course, in France with our trade union leaders, however weak those happen to be. In order to succeed, he shouldn't be overwhelmed by public outcry and unrest in the French streets starting in September after our sacrosanct holidays.
Thank you, Christine. Pascal.
First, very quickly, on enlargement, yes, the French will remain reluctant to any new enlargement. And the main reason for that is because of the elephant in the room of enlargement, which is Turkey. And whatever new stream of negotiation would start would immediately reactivate this issue of whether Turkey is or not to join the European Union, and the French answer is clearly no. One sentence on a point which hasn't been mentioned yet. Of course, one of the people who should be happy with the re-election of Macron is Mrs. von der Leyen, if she intends to have a second term. That's very good news for her, and my expectation is that she will do a second term as a president of the EU Commission. Finally, on Mario Monti's point, Mario, you belong to a series of extremely respected people who believe that intellectual charisma and clout should be popular. I'm afraid this is not the case anymore, at least in the case of Macron. He is undoubtedly intellectually very superior, but as Christine said very diplomatically, this can be perceived as arrogance. And I think it's the same around the table of the European Council as it is with, let's say, more ordinary people. So at the end of the day, it results in whether or not he's able to maneuver within the European system. And on this, I agree with Christine. On the global issue, and it's an issue, I mean, I don't discuss with Macron on French politics, where my value added is very limited. But when we discuss, including in my capacity of chair of the Paris Peace Forum, about this terribly fragmented, divided world, and what could we do and what should we do, his answer is always, we have to make the EU stronger. That is basic recipe for trying to fix a world that is clearly moving in the wrong direction in many, many, many dimensions. Over to you.
Thank you, Pascal. Well, we come to the end of a great session. My concluding thought is, in most respects, Macron's victory is very good for Europe. I think that there will be some reform of fiscal rules. There might be a second recovery fund. There might be progress on European defence, strategic autonomy, and so on. In other respects, not so good. Enlargement, some of us regret the French blockage on that. Not sure that everything that the French want to do on industrial policy is entirely compatible with liberal economics. And of course, we haven't talked much about the British relationship, but Macron is the hardest of the hard when it comes to dealing with the UK, but that's another subject for another webinar on another day. We've come to the end of our time. Thanks very much to Pascal, Christine, and Ben. Thanks to everybody for their excellent contributions to the floor, and hope to see you all again at another webinar or seminar very soon. Cheerio.
Bye, folks.